Psychedelic Exceptionalism. Oh, hello my friends of the Psychedelic Renaissance. It's Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, and today I'd like to discuss psychedelic exceptionalism. Most of us are familiar with the term psychedelic exceptionalism, but for those of us who are not, in its simplest form, psychedelic exceptionalism is the belief that certain drugs are safer than others. It's a question about which kinds of drugs are more beneficial to both the individual and society. Viewed through that lens, it is way easier to show such benefits with things like ayahuasca than it is with things like methamphetamine. And let me be clear, this is not a judgment against any individual at all. I support your right to put whatever you want to into your body. I am a cognitive, bodily, and spiritual absolutist. I make no judgments about your life choices, and I have compassion for those who struggle. The most ardent public intellectual pushing against psychedelic exceptionalism is Colombian neuroscientist Dr. Carl Hart, author of the book Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And while I find agreement with Dr. Hart in many areas, including our need to grow up about the subject of drugs already, I part company with him when he makes statements like, "Let people know that, shit, your psilocybin or LSD use is just like my crack use." For Dr. Hart, it's just all about getting high in one form or another. And while there's nothing wrong with using psychedelics in a recreational setting just to get high, there are still other ways of utilizing them. Many of us prefer to use these medicines not in recreational settings, but in ways that probe our heart, mind, and soul in ceremonial settings. We explore the untapped areas of ourselves and others through a variety of lenses, and then work to integrate that experience into our lives once the journey has ended. That's not just getting high. That's a regiment, a roadmap for improving ourselves so that we can improve the larger society in which we all live. Dr. Hart makes no secret about his heroin use, and truth be told, I don't have a problem with it. Dr. Hart is extremely smart, accomplished, he's a best-selling author and the chair of an Ivy League university. He's an exceptional man. I have no doubt that any exceptional person can enjoy heroin from time to time and not have it ruin their lives. I am not exceptional. Heroin, in all probability, would ruin my life the way it has ruined the lives of millions of other people in a way that cannabis and mushrooms, simply haven't. Now, that's not to say that just because I couldn't handle heroin, nobody should be allowed to use heroin. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, far from it. All I'm saying is that we need to be educated about these differences in different kinds of drugs so that we can keep people safe. Dr. Hart is echoed by Madison Margolis in an article from Double Blind magazine. So the question becomes, should psychedelics be treated so differently from other drugs, given that any substance may have the power to soothe or scorch the human psyche and body too? That's the crux of the psychedelic exceptionalism debate. First of all, that is not the crux of the psychedelic exceptionalism debate. The crux of the debate has to do with levels of relevant harm to both the individual and society. What Madison is saying here is that since a baseball bat and a gun can both be used to kill a person, well, they're more or less the same thing, right? Second, mushrooms do not scorch the body. LSD does not scorch the body, peyote does not scorch the body, ayahuasca does not scorch the body, and mescaline does not scorch the body. This incessant need to make highly questionable comparisons between addictive drugs and entheogens is exactly why I find it so difficult to take the anti-psychedelic exceptionalism position seriously. And to compare a person having a bad trip and say that their psyche is being scorched, as if to say that something like LSD has the same deteriorating effects on both the brain and the mind, as other things like methamphetamine or crack is quite frankly absurd. We all know that LSD, ayahuasca, and peyote, and mushrooms, and all of it have very little deleterious effects on the body. And yet, we are all scared to say it for fear of coming off politically incorrect. When people's lives are at stake, I don't care much about political correctness. So let's get politically incorrect. Dr. Hart and Double Blind Mag are leaving out a major part of this story, namely the levels of violent crime that come with certain kinds of drug use. The crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s saw a level of violence so intense that Thomas Sowell commented, "In American high-crime neighborhoods, the probability that a given young man living there will be killed is greater than the probability that a given American soldier would be killed in World War II." People addicted to crack behave very differently from people sitting in peyote circles. As one major crack dealer from New York, Corey Pegues, stated, "Crack fiends were breaking into cars for stereos, breaking into neighbors' cribs for television and VCRs, stealing their mom's jewelry, their kid's record player, anything they could trade for crack." Or consider this testimony from a cab driver. "I've had my share of run-ins with these women on crack. One night a woman flagged me down, and I could tell right away she wasn't right. She looked like a broomstick, and I knew she was a piper. But she had this little baby with her, so I felt sorry for her. The cabbie decided to pick up this woman and offered to give her a ride to a shelter. The woman, instead, wanted to be dropped off at a crack house. No way I'm gonna give her money for drugs. That little baby stank like piss, and the Pampers hadn't been changed in a long time. All crack addicts care about is getting that pipe, and they'll do you in for money. But she looked so bad dragging that baby around." Child neglect cases doubled from 1980 to 1994. 75% of those cases involved drug use. The majority drug used? Crack. Mushrooms, which Dr. Hart believes is just like smoking crack, are much more difficult to indict in this situation. What's more, during the crack epidemic, violent crime skyrocketed in New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia. In one night in New York, 9 innocent bystanders were gunned down when rival gangs decided to open fire on each other over turf. In another instance, one rival crew gang raped a woman in front of her boyfriend. They then shot his dick off. You don't typically see that kind of violence in a 5-MeO DMT circle. What I find so interesting is that Dr. Hart was raised in Carroll City, one of the most violent suburbs of Florida and perhaps even the larger United States. So Dr. Hart is well aware of this level of violence. I'm just so curious as to why he ignores it in his later life. In my home state of Oregon, back in 2020, we passed 2 ballot initiatives, Measure 109 and Measure 110. Measure 109 made psilocybin-assisted therapy somewhat legal. It's kind of a gray area. Measure 110 decriminalized all drugs, leading to open drug markets in the city, commonly referred to around these parts as camping. A quick word on that. Calling this crisis camping obfuscates the issue in a way that is totally lacking in compassion. I was once houseless. I lived in my car. I froze at night. I starved during the day. That is not camping. Calling it camping is a wonderful way to ignore a humanitarian crisis. These are not campsites. They are open markets for hard and addictive drugs. Decriminalization in Oregon so far has been a monumental disaster. So much so that we are experiencing the city's largest exodus of tax-paying residents and a staggering influx of people who need compassion and help, not incentives to continue living destructive lives on the streets. Like it or not, taxpayers stop cities from crumbling. The reason decriminalization is failing in Oregon is obvious. It's happening because we weren't allowed to say what we all know to be true, that crack, heroin, and methamphetamine have a higher potential for abuse and violence than do LSD, mushrooms, and ayahuasca. Oregon decriminalization campaigners took the postmodernist relativist approach that nothing is better or worse, everything is just different, and we are now seeing the end result of that Edward Sayidian bullshit. Anti-psychedelic exceptionalists will often point to Portugal, where all drugs have been decriminalized since 2001. They will say that Portugal doesn't have these problems. And that's true. Portugal doesn't have these problems because that is not an apt comparison. Portugal does not have open drug markets. In Portugal, you will be arrested for doing what people do every single day in cities like Portland, Seattle, and Oakland. According to Stanford addiction expert Dr. Keith Humphreys, all of these cities, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, are libertarian in their views about drugs and alcohol. In Portugal, they put pressure on people to go into treatment. It's social pressure and pressure toward making people change their behavior. That's why it works in Portugal. You see, we do the opposite, which is why it doesn't work here. So to those good folks living in cities that are working to decriminalize everything, here's a heads up from someone who lives in the first state to do so. If you do not draw a very fine line between psychedelics and hard and addicting drugs, you're not going to get naked hippies in the park throwing a frisbee. You're going to get randos on your front porch smoking meth, starting fights with your neighbors, followed by the mass exodus of the very people who keep cities alive. Taxpayers. Yes, drug laws need to be reformed. Yes, hard drug users deserve dignity and respect. Yes, they should enter rehab and treatment programs and not be thrown in prison. We do need to correct this issue, and I am 100% on the same side of Dr. Hart in that regard. Although, what cities like Portland and Seattle might be demonstrating is that decriminalizing everything might be a slight overcorrection. If you're interested to see what has become of Portland since the decriminalization of all drugs, might I suggest following PDX Real on Instagram. It's very eye-opening. We are told to have compassion, and I agree, compassion is paramount here. Allowing people to destroy their lives is not compassionate. Allowing people to ruin the lives of their family and friends, that's not compassionate. Allowing women to live in these open drug markets where they are sexually violated on a daily basis is not compassionate. Leaving piles of used needles in parks where kids play is not compassionate.
You remember just last week, a 2-year-old was stuck by a needle on a MAX train.
Allowing people to slowly kill themselves is not compassionate.
We're giving them the tools that they need to stay alive just long enough to end up dying on our streets.
Ignoring these realities of violent crime, homicide, and rape is not only not compassionate, but it only hurts the people suffering the most. Now, this is not to say that anyone who supports these ideas is personally lacking in compassion. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is we need to have accountability with compassion. Compassion without accountability isn't compassionate at all. A lot of these hard substance abuse issues do stem from trauma, no doubt about it. But does that make it okay? Well, maybe it does make it okay. You know, I could be persuaded. But what about the victims? With that, I'd like to end this video with a small challenge. Please feel free to answer 1, 2, or all 4 of the following questions. Number 1, how many people do you know are using meth to curb their iboga addiction? Number 2, are there many ayahuasca-related drive-by shootings of which you are aware? 3, how many times have you tested your fentanyl to make sure no one contaminated it with psilocybin? And 4, when was the last time you heard that people eating mushrooms opened fire on innocent bystanders over a turf war? If you've made it this far and find value in this content, Please consider giving this video a like and a share and subscribing to the Psychedelic Historian YouTube channel. Also, it would be great to link up on Instagram. Find me at Psychedelic Historian. What are your thoughts about psychedelic exceptionalism? Let me know in the comments below. And until we meet again, I'm Tom Hatsis, your psychedelic historian, reminding you that you free your mind by using your brain. Peace.